Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back. Today's episode is called Whose Side Are You On? And Scott, we want to talk a little bit about this thing that we all experience in life sooner or later, where we're kind of forced to pick a side. Battle lines are drawn in a lot of different ways, whether it's on the political spectrum, you have to choose what side of the aisle you sit on, whether it's in personal conflict, choosing one person's viewpoint over another of how something went down or how something occurred, and you're forced to pick a side. And it can range from very personal things like that to obviously the big worldview perspective on how we understand life and those around us. Obviously, on this program, our goal is to help each other understand God's perspective, and that's really what this comes down to when we pick on the sides or how we see things, that we want to be on God's side. But Scott, it's important to realize that this is not a new issue. People have been drawing these battle lines for a long time. In fact, we have several instances, one of which we're going to start talking about this morning, where Jesus was, they were attempting to get him embroiled and kind of pick a side. How do you view these things? And Jesus, well, I love it. Jesus isn't going to play these games.
Yeah, you think about John the 8th chapter where you have this woman who was caught in adultery. She's brought before Jesus. And the amazing thing about the people there, where you have the Pharisees that are there, the scribes that are there, that ultimately their whole purpose was to test him. It wasn't even about the side that Jesus was going to choose. It was actually about maybe he could choose the wrong sides, and either way is going to be a bad answer that they were trying to catch him in. And that's the sad reality. So often when you talk about politics, you talk about various things today, that there's always this desire to not really come down to what the answers really are, to have a really good conversation about something. It ultimately just comes down to the desire to be right or to prove somebody wrong and those types of things. And the motivation's an issue. And John the 8th chapter, you have where Jesus is actually sitting among people in the temple and he's teaching them. And all of a sudden, the Pharisees and the scribes bring this woman in, and they say that she's been caught in the very act of adultery, and they put her down in the middle of the court. And in verse 4 of John the 8th chapter says, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" And Tyler, it's amazing to me from this perspective to break this down into how everybody would have been viewing this. First of all, you have the crowd. She's in the middle of this crowd. They've been listening to him talk, and who knows, we're not told necessarily what he was teaching about, but you can imagine what Jesus was talking about, compassion and talking about love and the desire to serve the Father as he did so often. And then they throw this woman down in front of him. No care for her. She was just simply a pawn in the middle of this scheme that they were trying to get caught up in. And so they throw her down. They tell him that, and Jesus obviously knew what the old law would have said on this subject. She deserves to die. And you imagine from her perspective, I'm not going to make it out of the temple. I'm going to die for what has happened. And in verse 6, it's interesting how they even just kind of tell you exactly what the issue was. They were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote on the ground. But they had persisted in asking him. He straightened up and said, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." We can spend a lot of time trying to figure out what Jesus was writing, and it doesn't really matter. It would be neat to know, certainly, but whatever it was, he certainly was showing that he wasn't going to answer their question very quickly in verse 5, which is what they wanted him to do. So they pester him until he's going to answer, and he does not answer the way that they want him to. But we see their motivation. It was simply to test him. It wasn't about love for truth. It wasn't about defending the faith. It was solely about trying to catch Jesus Christ. It was not about this woman at all. And that's the danger so often when we are in situations today, that we take these sides, and it's not about God at all. It's about which side are you on. Are you on my team or on somebody else's team? Are you the enemy or are you friend? Rather than understanding what it truly matters. And that's what Jesus goes on and does here. He'll talk to them about these amazing things is what he says. Well, look, he who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone. Just go ahead and throw the first stone. That's what you need to do. He could have been talking about, alluding to the Old Testament, that they would have known that the witness is supposed to throw the first stone. And you have a lot of different things that it can kind of go into. at this point. But the reality is, when he looks up after all of this, everybody's gone. And so he straightens up in verse 10 and says, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go from now on, sin no more." And he's not saying that she didn't do something. That's not the point. His point is, go on living without sin. Go forward from this point and not sin. And that's the amazing thing about our Savior. You talk about showing compassion, showing the gospel to somebody. I'm not going to condemn you. I'm here to show you compassion. I'm not telling you that you need to continue doing what you're doing. You certainly don't. You need to change. And that's the struggle for us when we talk about this subject. Jesus, his desire was to please the Father. His desire was to show compassion, to save souls. It wasn't about the Pharisees. It wasn't about the scribes. It was about him and this woman and the desire to help this woman. That's exactly what he does. And so often we can kind of get caught up putting somebody in the middle of a situation and just using them as a pawn, as you'll see this in politics all the time when people do this, rather than really getting into the point of the conversation, trying to save somebody's souls rather than just trying to win an argument.
Right. And the hard part of that is we are really good, whether it's we as the people who represent the sides that we're talking about, or we just as people as are trying to process the debates and the conflict around us in life. We're good at hypothetical situations, right, and forgetting that there are real people with real lived experiences, and some are more in line with the average situation than the others, but there's just so much danger, I think, in kind of painting with a broad brushstroke and forgetting that there are actual souls behind each concept or story that we're talking about. This woman has a past. She's been made in the image of God. She is caught, and the Pharisees, to your point, are just using her to prove their point of, well, this is what the law says. This is how this is the right interpretation of the law. Where they're in a culture and a society in Roman times, in the pagan culture, where sexual sin is a very loose definition, and it's not even a sin, right? It's something that just is part of culture at that time. And so you've got the lines of what's right and what's wrong, what's moral or what's immoral. And Jesus is here. Obviously, again, this point, he's not spelling out what's moral. The implied aspect is, yes, she's guilty, but I'm not going to condemn her. This is an opportunity for her to grow and for opportunity for her to recognize grace. She has a choice moving forward. Again, this is an individual soul that she could go out the next day and she could go right back to the situation that however the Sadducees or the Pharisees and the scribes found her, or she could start following Jesus. And so that's the choice that each and every one of us have, and that's the choice everybody around us has, regardless of what sort of hot-button issue or topic they've been embroiled in, regardless of the baggage they carry in their past. Every single person has the opportunity to follow Jesus. And, we talk about these lives that are caught up in some of these things, and certainly we can say, oh, I can't believe that person's involved with that. Well, look, sin is sin. We cannot sit here and categorize it. God has said, if you're going to break one part of the law, you break all of it. So, well, I haven't murdered anybody. I haven't had sexual immorality. I'm not killing anybody, but have you lied? Because the same law that says it's wrong to kill is the same law as that's saying it's wrong to lie, or it's wrong, to worship other things or put things before God. And so from his perspective, we need to see things like God does, including the souls that are caught up in these things. Scott, a popular phrase that we often hear is, we hate the sin, not the sinner. And I'm concerned that we, whether we're on the outside or on the inside, we associate those things too closely. Yes, we choose to sin, and it can influence us and it can impact us, but that's not who we are. It doesn't have to be who we are. People will identify themselves by their sin all too easily, and that includes Christians and the things that we continue to go on and struggle with. With the help of Jesus, we're transformed, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that, yes, we can hate the sin, we can understand that it is horrible, but we have to understand the precious value and how much God loves and cares for the souls that are caught up in trying to fill this void with those things, that they're still looking for the Father ultimately, whether they want to recognize that or not.
And that's the struggle for us, I think, is you can go after adultery as an example, the conversation that is going on in John the 8th chapter, and you can say a lot of things that are truth from the standpoint of, the book, chapter, and verse. This is what this is going to talk about. But you miss the intent of what is being said. You miss, to your point, the soul of this person. I guarantee that this woman left not thinking that those Pharisees really cared about me. That they had no desire. They could have been right of what the old law says, but they had no concern for her soul at all. The compassion of Jesus is what shows her, okay, I should not be committing adultery. I need to make a choice now of whether or not I'm going to your point. But that gave her an opportunity to change, to want to change. Other people may have still viewed her to be this adulterous woman, which they probably did in some cases. But the reality is all of a sudden now she understood that she was saved by Jesus. And Jesus was going to be the one that was going to identify her and define her now. And that was the choice that she had, to your point. That's the same choice that we have. That's the danger of when we talk about certain subjects, and we need to talk about them, but we also need to understand that there's souls behind them, and the importance of being mindful of those souls, striving to push them towards Jesus, not just solely showing them that they were wrong and beating them down. It's actually trying to save people's souls.
Right. And let's just be clear, right? We're talking about these hot button issues today, like abortion, like race issues, like identity and sexual identity, and all these different things that we can get so caught up in. And yes, we know what God's word says about them. The point of our conversation today, Scott, is there are real people like this woman who is caught in sin, and we have an opportunity to show truth and grace and love to those people. As we kind of wrap up this episode, I want to go over to the Old Testament, to the book of Joshua in chapter 5, because I think this is a powerful example of how we will draw our battle lines in these situations on these cultural and certainly moral issues, and how we just get it backwards. It's, okay, I think this is right, they think this is wrong, or vice versa, and so, God's on my side. That is the completely backwards way to look at it, and I think there's no better place to see that than in Joshua chapter 5, when they've been led right up to Jericho's doorstep, right in front of the wall. God's saying, you're going to conquer them. And ultimately, the commander of the Lord's army shows up, and so Joshua sees him in this account beginning in verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" We could pretty easily slot that into this conversation. Who are you for? Whose side are you on? And he said, "No." That's not the end of it, but I just love that, God, essentially this representative of God here. Whose side are you on, God? No. That is a bad question. But he goes on. He said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. You go on into chapter 6, and it's the amazing description of how the people are going to march around the city these days and make the walls fall. And it's ultimately God who's going to make the walls fall. But it's because it's not about God being on their side. It's about the Israelites, Joshua, and the people that he's leading being on God's side. And that's absolutely how we have to view our situation in our lives in these conversations that we're having. Is God on my side or their side in this? No, stop. It's about, am I on God's side? Are they on God's side? And I really have to stop and honestly consider those questions and strive so that we're all on the side of the Lord, because God's is the side that wins at the end of the day. When we're talking about justice, when we're talking about who's right or wrong with morality, it's God's side that wins. And people might disagree with that, but they are wrong. And so when we come to these conversations, we have to remember so carefully that there are real souls at stake, that we have an opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives, that we can be transformed in our lives by understanding that it's not getting God on my side, but about getting on his side, because that's the motivation that says, I want to be on God's side. I want to see things the way God sees them, because I understand that he's made me and I'm from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.